Zoom Data lets business users move past the usual hurdles and get to business insight faster. They provide the world's fastest visual analytics supported by a data platform that can connect to any big data or legacy data source and make it actionable at the speed of thought. Zoom Data empowers end users to have an immersive data discovery experience. The goal is to make better quality decisions faster. Big data can be complicated. They make things easy. Hop online to zoomdata.com for more information.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is, of course, 3 o'clock Eastern Time on a Thursday. So for those of you who have been tuned in, and even those who have not, it's time once again for DM Radio. Yes, indeed, my name is Eric Kavanaugh. I will be your humble, if excitable host for the show that is designed to peel away the marketing veneer so we can get down to brass tacks and figure out what is going on in the field of data management. And the topic today, it's a fast-moving topic, folks, a spark of genius, how the Hadoop ecosystem evolves. So, of course, we're talking about this fascinating open-source project, Hadoop, spun out of Yahoo, of course. Then there was Yarn. I love these names. Yarn, yet another resource negotiator. And then Spark came along. So Apache Spark, under the stewardship of Databricks these days, has really taken the industry by storm. We're going to talk about that, but we're going to talk about what's happening overall in this fascinating open source movement. And just a couple quick notes at the top of the hour. Big thanks to Zoom Data for their sponsorship, letting us bring you this content free of charge. We'll be hearing from my good buddy Des Blanchfield, calling in at 4 or actually 5 in the morning over there across the entire planet from Sydney, Australia. We're going to hear from Richard Williamson of Silicon Valley Data Science, Eric Sammer from Rokana, and then Ruhala Farchi, I hope I pronounced that correctly, of Zoom Data. Good stuff. So open source. I've been following this stuff very closely since at least 2005, when I looked up and was doing some research on transparency in federal spending, as a matter of fact. And I realized that the Apache web server was powering like 52 or 53% of websites in the world. And how cool was that? And what is this thing, the Apache Foundation? So since 2005, I've focused pretty intently understanding what open source is doing. And frankly, in the first few years of the show, I would always ask our guests, how big a threat does open source pose to traditional enterprise software licensing? Because let's face it, enterprise software has been really, really expensive for a pretty long time. That's why companies like Oracle and SAP were able to accrue vast treasure troves of cash. Of course, these days we have other players as well, Amazon Web Services. Of course, Apple is sitting on a mountain of cash, most of it overseas from what I understand. But nonetheless, this open source movement really is changing how software is built. It's the new epicenter of innovation. So we're going to talk all about that stuff today. Of course, we invite your questions. Feel free to tweet with the hashtag of DMRadio16, and we'll try to catch up with that and ask your questions. And with that, Des Blanchfield, you've been following open source for quite some time. Welcome back to the show, and what are your thoughts on the evolving Hadoop ecosystem?
Hey, thanks, Eric. Hey, everyone. Interestingly, one of my very first jobs in computing was actually working for a company called Celtec Software, and they used to take DOS and other PC-based programs that back then we didn't even call it open source, even though the software was for free. We just called it free software, and it didn't really take off. It was a fairly bizarre concept, and I think in those early days of the microcomputer, the PC world, we had people like Bill Gates jump up and down when people stole copies of his BASIC that he and Paul had written, put out on punch paper tape from memory. So people really didn't understand the value of what open source as a concept meant, and we had this very old school approach to writing software and keeping the software and the code close to our chest and distributing it as a executable. I think it's a given now. It's all the way up the food chain in senior management to the board level. Even my mum, who's about 72, 73 now, people not only get open source as a concept, but they've actually changed the way their organizations behave around the way they approach software and the way they approach what it means to kind of give code away and contribute and collaborate. And I think it's a fantastic concept because there's plenty of ways to make money out of software, and it isn't just selling executables. or just selling maintenance licensing. And I think one of the things it's helped bring about is something that we're probably struggling to deal with in many ways, and that is this rapid rate of change. Because everyone can contribute, and Apache's HTTP server, the web serving engine is a good example. But then there's also things like Firefox, the web browser, where they are almost everywhere. They're kind of synonymous with day-to-day life. These tools are free and open, and they're out there, and there's hundreds of thousands in some cases of people developing them, with these developing code for these things and committing code, and so things change very, very quickly. But the interesting shift that's taken place around what we've done with big data and big data processing platforms now, particularly with Hadoop and more often with things like Flink and Spark, is that the rate of adaptation has started to catch up. When we think about the shift over the last sort of 20, 25 years from big iron to small iron, sort of mainframes to sort of mini computers and micros, and now mobile phones are as powerful as those damn things. The hardware is shifting quickly, the network infrastructure is shifting quickly, and the software is shifting even faster. But I'm seeing a rate of adaptation change as well, where new concepts, new ideas, new platforms, new frameworks, new tool sets, new platforms, whatever are coming through. Companies are getting used to this idea that software is changing quickly, and they're getting used to the idea of shifting frameworks and adopting new and great things. So I'm really keen to hear people's thoughts around what that actually means now, where it's okay to throw out everything you did 3 to 5 years ago on a big Oracle platform, move to Hadoop, and then it's okay to move from Hadoop to maybe using the Hadoop file system, but a different compute platform. Because I think it's driving innovation in ways that we've never even imagined before.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, really it does speak to one of the major issues that we're facing in the industry today across the board, which is how do you transition from legacy environments to all the new stuff if you're not a brand new company? Of course, if you're brand new, well, you can start off in the cloud. You can start off with all the latest and greatest. You can get some of the vendors on the line today to help you out and do your thing. But if you're like most companies, especially Fortune 2000 companies, where you've got these incredibly heterogeneous IT environments, thousands of applications many times, a lot of them homegrown. How do you transition from that world into the new world? And I've got some ideas, quite frankly, but I'll be curious to throw it over to you, and then we'll bring in Richard from SBDS. Des?
I think what we're seeing now is that so large organizations do have these massive suites of software and traditional legacy platforms. So and in that world, you might have 3 different versions of say an Oracle database because you've got a very big platform. Say it might be your finance system. You don't really want to mess with that. It's sort of the underpinning engine that's funding your business. But then you've got ERP and other platforms that might move more quickly, and HR systems. Having a HR system where you can look up someone's name, having it down for a few hours or a day to upgrade is not that big a deal. But a payment gateway is a big deal. So you've got 3 or 4 versions of these bigger data platforms. But I think the shift in the shift in the development model and the shift in the deployment model of tools now is such that, and we've learned from sort of the classic A/B testing that search engines, and I recently went to a thing last year with I think it was a KDD event, a knowledge and data event here in Sydney. It was the first time I come to Australia, and some folk from Bing stood up and talked about how they developed code on an alley basis, and they rolled it out with A/B testing of a form that they would take 200,000 or 300,000 people's search queries and try that version of software and a version of the code and see what happened, and then if it worked, they would launch it and it would be the version. And afterwards, talking to a number of people who come from very old school legacy environments, they were aghast. Like, what? You develop code on an alley basis and you just run it? And I think that's happening now, where people are actually okay with things breaking as long as it's not your underpinning platform, like a financial platform that's underpinning a bank that you expect a credit card to be driven by. We've completely changed our thinking around how software is developed and how it's deployed. And we're going to see that more and more now, where I think one of our recent conversations that involved Internet of Things, we spoke about this idea that data is coming at us, and this whole schema on read concept has come about, where you might have version 1 of a widget, and it's got a database schema of some form or data format schema that's coming at us in one version. Then the next widget comes out, and it's got a slightly broader scope of data that it's sending us. We have to figure that out on the fly. We've changed our approach to how software is developed, how software is maintained, and in one sense, but I also think there's a consolidation happening. I think that some of these very diverse suites of software are almost coming together in more common structures. So instead of having 3 to 4 different database platforms because that's what the vendor used, we're now shifting to maybe one data lake and one data lake architecture and framework. And we might use different tool sets or analytics tools or programming language to build little widgets, but the underpinning framework is becoming more and more common. So to me, it's almost like the shift to one big Hadoop platform and everything running on Java in that sense, and a fairly common framework there. But lots of people writing tools that can plug into it, but it's their problem to deal with the language. I think that's a neat change because we're getting a lot more commonality in the platforms and a lot less divergence in the application suite.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, let's go ahead and bring in Richard Williamson from Silicon Valley Data Science. Welcome to TM Radio.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for the warm welcome. So just a bit about myself. Last 2.5 years I've been with SVDS, just doing some of the very things you mentioned, Eric, about taking Fortune 2000 companies through the journey of building out big data platforms and then really focusing on leveraging data science on top of those. We're a boutique consulting company focusing on building holistic teams trained in strategic and agile approaches to help businesses understand their customers and do go-to-market offerings. And we help the business align each project with their business objectives so that together we can create meaningful capabilities. So before Silicon Valley Data Science, I was actually with Walmart for several years and had the privilege to actually bring Hadoop into their environment in 2009 from the stores side. And there I learned a lot about, what does it mean to take this new technology and bring it into those older companies that have, made their bread and butter from legacy systems. So with that, early on I just saw the value of Hadoop as being a way that we at Walmart could transform the business and be able to leverage this vast amount of data better. And from a business standpoint, the open source model just meant so much because now we could, leverage this basically commodity software and hardware across much more hardware than we were looking at with traditional systems. And we didn't have to worry about the vendor lock-in that some typical data warehousing and data science platforms at that time before Hadoop had given us. And then from a technical standpoint, being an engineer, the thing I really love about Hadoop is it really liberates the engineer to now look at being able to store the data one time and then be able to access it from multiple execution frameworks versus the old school way where we, would have those different copies of data that was just mentioned earlier. And now, basically, right, we have one copy of data. We can run MapReduce against it. We can run Hive against it at that time to do different types of processing but store it once.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Just real quick, I'm curious to know, so in terms of this question of transitioning from the old world to the new world, obviously you have to do this one project at a time. And I'm guessing if I kind of read between the lines, what you're suggesting is that Hadoop can actually play a significant role in facilitating that transition by serving as a staging area or a landing zone, if you will, for enterprise data, and then being able to access it from multiple systems. I guess one of my big questions would be that throughway, if you will, from the Hadoop environment to these many different applications. Is that where Spark is coming into play to really facilitate that? Because you're talking about some interesting architecture to be able to have all these different applications hitting the same data to get their jobs done. Can you kind of talk about what's under the covers to make that happen?
Yeah, sure. So really before Spark, we just had HDFS and MapReduce, and MapReduce was a very verbose way of interacting with the data. And then Hive came along to make the SQL interface there. Spark is really, the MapReduce 2.0, as I think of it. We have a much more concise language with Scala. where we can do, many more times the amount of data processing in much fewer lines of code. And it also brings to the table kind of the real-time processing with Spark Streaming. So now, not only, Hadoop really came out as a batch processing system, but now with Spark Streaming, I just put out a blog post this week where I kind of walk through a demo of taking the Meetup.com data. They provide a data stream, so I walk a user through how you can kind of ingest that data and then do some actual real-time data science on that by building a prediction around the number of RSVPs that are coming through there. So just Spark is such a vibrant ecosystem right now. There's so many different components, and it really opens up, how you interact with that data. It reminds me of I actually started out as a SAS developer, doing statistical programming. And SAS was kind of a 4GL that had like a proc SQL where you could do SQL, then you could do data step programming or whatever. But you can move back and forth between this programming model and a SQL model. And now with Spark SQL, I get to relive that, except in a very distributed, high-volume environment.
Yeah, and I'll throw one more question, then I'll throw you to Des. Speaking of streaming, since that's the topic du jour, there's another company, of course, that's come along, Confluent, which has taken Apache Kafka under its wing for development and for sale and so forth. How big a deal is Kafka going to be in terms of fueling all these different systems? Because, of course, that's the engine that drove LinkedIn. That's where those guys came from. What do you think about Kafka?
Sure. We use Kafka really to abstract the ingestion stream. So the blog post I just mentioned, that we actually use that there to be able to take the same data and feed it to multiple pieces of the architecture. So your base data input layer, and then also like the aggregation layer, and then also the prediction layer. So yeah, Kafka is going to be the kind of first part of that. Okay,
cool. Des, take it away.
I remember reading your blog post, actually, your original tweet, the link went to a 404, and I was cursing. I was like, where the hell is it? Anyway, I found it quickly. I'm interested in your thoughts, Richard, around the transition from, and I think you mentioned it earlier on in the pre-call section, the transition from sort of typical application design models of sort of, developing an app, understanding the data a bit better than what we do when we're streaming, and then sort of deploying the stuff in a cluster and running jobs in batch mode to kind of what we're seeing now with where streaming is kind of the thing, and we're assuming the data is just somewhere in the ether in some shared memory platform, and we're kind of just grabbing the bits we were interested in now. I'm keen on your thoughts and any predictions you might have around how that's changed the approach to just the basic concept of data processing, where before we would have sort of, as you said, we would pull it all into some platform where it's sort of, write once, read many times, and we just ran things over it. Now we're kind of, we're just assuming the data's coming at us as streams, and we're kind of, almost plugging little, to use a Unix model, like the little T app, just chugging little things in and just piping them from one place to another to get stuff from it. Where do you think this is taking us from a design point of view, and kind of what would it look like in a few years when we move from this model of a known source of data to unknown things that are just being streamed at us?
Yeah, so there's really two fundamental ways to look at streaming data. One is kind of the storm approach of taking action on each event coming in, or event-based action, whereas Spark Streaming takes the micro-batch approach, where you're basically still doing a batch window, but you're making that batch window really tiny, like a few seconds at a time that you're going to process this new piece of data coming in. So I really kind of start still with that batch, background of, I used to do this on a day interval. Now I'm going to do it on a 10-second interval. And the nice thing in the Spark environment is that's pretty seamless. So I can take the same code to some degree that I was using in the batch sense, and then apply that directly in the streaming model.
I guess we're going to have to deal with this whole transition in a very short time, because there's lots of talk about the fourth industrial revolution, and it's sort of underpinned by the world being covered with sensors and billions of them. I have a curious question I throw out in general, and that is I have no idea how they're going to connect all these billions of devices because we've kind of run out of IP version 4 just for laptops and PCs and iPhones. But anyway, but I guess when we've got sensors everywhere that are potentially collecting stuff ad hoc and throwing it into some framework, we're going to make that shift by default from the sort of traditional batch mode approach to little tiny snippets of stuff coming through and decisions being made quickly, aren't we?
Yeah, the one thing I'd add to that, from the business side, you first have to decide how quickly can I make decisions on this data, right? So there's still certain areas of business that can't benefit from streaming data because their window of execution is still on a daily basis. The things that machine learning now allows us to do is have the machines take action on those things much better. So that enables the business to now start thinking in this much tighter window of time that we're reacting on.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've seen that in that you deal with Fortune 500 companies. And I've watched and been intimately involved in the transition to the financial services and banking platforms where humans clicked on things and made trades, and then now all of a sudden machines are doing the trades. And we've got fun things like people trying to get their clusters close to the other people's clusters so that the round trip time of a ping is lower than anybody else. And we've got. There have been some incidents like Black Tuesday where things just got out of sync and billions of dollars fell on the floor. Are you seeing a massive challenge in these large organizations having to shift their thinking around how this comes about, like how they shorten the decision time through necessity to stay relevant in the market?
Yeah, I think you're kind of opening this up, and Eric may have some good insight as well. But yeah, just like making that transition, we still work with large companies that are shifting from at one time doing a daily pipeline in the batch, but doing an hourly pipeline now, right? Because we can speed this time frame up. Things like Kudu that just came out now allow us to do incremental updates to our backend store that powers things like Spark. So there's the technology is really just now getting there to make this possible, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Well, let's go ahead and bring our next guest in, Eric Sammer from Rokana. First of all, welcome to DM Radio.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
It's a great set of topics thus far. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've obviously been in this space for a while, and you were talking before the show about that rate of change, which Des mentioned to you. What do you think about, from the CIO's perspective, how can companies take advantage of all this great new tech without jeopardizing their ability to support things or without becoming too beholden to their service providers?
It's a great question, sort of near and dear to my heart. My background is sort of half on the distributed systems and data processing and collection story query side, and half on the data center operations side. So I worked at a couple of different places where I ran data centers, and I was a consumer of a lot of this technology, responsible for keeping the lights on, so to speak. So certainly near and dear to my heart. I think the challenge there is, most of the problems that CIOs have around being sort of a service provider, either internally to the enterprise or externally working with, if you're a CIO for somebody who's like an, e-commerce, system or something like Richard mentioned, like Walmart, for instance, that actually has, B2C relationships there. You're a service provider whether you like it or not. So, the whole notion of providing high quality SLAs and all these other kinds of things, these are business differentiators. It's not sufficient in this market, in this world, to simply look at technology or, quote unquote, IT as a cost center. It's a business enabler and it's a differentiator. So if you're Home Depot competing with Lowe's, for instance, if people are getting exceptions on a website and can't complete a transaction, they're going to go to your competitor. They have that optionality. So, when I talk to CIOs at Rokana and prior to Rokana at Cloudera, when I was there, we talked to CIOs, and it's not a technology problem in a lot of ways. I mean, the technology is there. The question is, are CIOs trying to minimize risk by eliminating innovation sort of that whole thing of like no one ever gets fired for buying IBM or something like that? Like, are they
Right.
trying to stick to the way that they've been doing things? Or are they willing to look at some of these technologies and say, sure, there's some element of risk because they're new and bleeding edge and all this other stuff, but can I take advantage of that and use that as a differentiator to help drive business initiatives? And like, maybe that's hand wavy, but like from my perspective, this isn't the technology problem. Like I said, it's there. It's a willingness problem and a prioritization problem within the enterprise.
Yeah, it's a cultural issue and it's an organizational issue. I mean, I think most managers and especially senior managers should know that a lot of people are not real keen on change, and you will get pushback from people, and there are issues, and you have to put out more fires. And a lot of times it's a question in the manager's mind of, okay, which battle do I want to fight today? How much energy do I have to field all these complaints? So it's really an issue that boils down to human beings and just trying to effect cultural change or just organizational change, right?
I think that's it. I think you nailed it. And I think technology can be built in such a way that it is an enabler and resilient to change, or it can be built in a way where it's incredibly static and difficult to change. And I think, and of course, there's a whole world of engineers and people building things like pacemakers that have like a different level of criticality. And then there's the world of people who are running online stores and things like that. And there was like this most recent Black Friday, for instance. I know there's always stories about the organizations that kind of fall over under the load and the organizations that are resilient to that kind of load, and the ability to sort of withstand those kinds of things. But I think when you were talking about open source when we opened the show, and why is that interesting and how is that different? It's not. I mean, we're in this world where we're not trying to eliminate change. We're trying to embrace it. So on the engineering side, you talk about things like agile development methodologies and stuff like that. And the question isn't how do we prevent requirements from changing. The question is how do we respond in the face of requirements changing? And I think CIOs, when they look at how do I deal with these kinds of things, if you're looking at, and by open source, we're sort of implicitly talking about things like open APIs and file formats and things that don't lock us into specific technologies or vendors, which is really all about agility and optionality, and things like pricing leverage and all that other kind of stuff over vendors. Rokana, for instance, builds almost exclusively on top of open source data infrastructure, things like HDFS, Kafka, Spark, Impala, like all of these sort of weird named things that we're talking about here, the menagerie. But I mean, like the reason we do that is to facilitate optionality both for us and for our customer, who's looking to take real-time machine data feeds and things like that Rokana sources from routers and hosts and switches and all this other kind of stuff, machine data, and say for the things that Rokana is good at, like triage and diagnostics and what's happening and how do I keep the lights on and how do I solve production issues, that's a place where Rokana is strong. And then there's applications like fraud detection and analysis and things where there requires specialized knowledge that, quite frankly, Rokana as an organization doesn't have, where customers say, hey, I'm already working with a Palantir or an ArcSight or a threat stream, or pick your specialized vendor there. Can you guys integrate with them in a way that doesn't require sort of unnatural maneuvers to get access to that data? And on these kinds of platforms, the answer today is yes, whereas historically maybe it's been no.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in terms of making that segue from legacy environments to this new world of options, and let's face it, you got to do it sooner or later. Everyone's going to do it. Well, not everyone, but just about every big business is going to have to do it, and every mid-sized business, I would argue, needs to do that as well. It seems to me that the Hadoop ecosystem really does provide a nice foundation for the future, meaning you can install whatever components you need in your environment and then incrementally, as they often say, land and expand, meaning as soon as you've proven out to the management team that it's a useful environment for getting stuff done, you can start adding data. You can start adding systems, and it becomes a sort of de facto marshaling area for data, which, if it's protected, if it's safe, obviously, and if you've built good connectors to it, can just only add more and more value over time, right?
I think you're right. The challenge, of course, is executing on that, and I think the challenge, there's no shortage of CIOs, or enterprises that have brought in like the cool technology, right? Spark, HDFast, Hadoop. I haven't met a CIO that doesn't have a quote unquote big data, strategy. I think it's like it's the equivalent of when I was in high school, everybody wanted Air Jordans. I think CIOs see like their friend getting a Hadoop cluster and they feel like they need one too. They don't know what it does, but they sure do need one. I think that's all well and good. The challenge here isn't the technology. The challenge is being able to use the technology to fulfill a business need. And that's where you get into, I think, you start to really, the rubber hits the road on that one, where you kind of go like, okay, so I'm a large bank. Do I have a bunch of people who understand parallel data processing and distributed systems? I mean, sure, you can go hire them. The question is the rest of the enterprise software market, the ISVs, the traditional folks like your Oracles, your Informaticas, your SAPs, your SaaS, Richard mentioned SaaS. Like, I think these guys are replatforming so that they can bring this sort of new breed of data management infrastructure to traditional teams that sort of understand those kinds of tools. And then there's like, okay, well, what do you do when you encounter a case where you don't have a system that has replatformed quickly enough, or do I have a special need where I need to really sort of augment either talent or look to a new vendor who's thinking about ETL or messaging or data integration or data center monitoring in sort of a new and interesting way that sort of keeps pace with the ecosystem around it.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's great stuff. Well, let's bring in our third guest, and then I'll let Des kind of run the roundtable when we get around to that. We have Ruhala from Zoom Data on the line. And folks, I took a demo of Zoom Data when I was at the Strata conference just a couple of weeks ago, and it is really, really cool stuff. So Ruhala, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi,
So go ahead. Yeah, just dive right in.
No. Yeah, so we've had a lot of interesting conversation about agility and agility in the face of these disruptive trends with open source and with a number of different things that are out there. At Zoom Data, we tend to try and embrace as much of that as possible, right? Because for most of our customers, it's coming and they're dealing with the same kinds of questions that we've been posing on this program, and for us, it's all been about choice and about providing the customers with a choice of how they want to manage their data, how they want to bring that into different backends, how they want to look at that from a historical perspective, or if they want to be able to do things with the real-time data as an enabler to the business. And so I think Eric hit on it really well with being able to use the technology to fulfill a business need. That's kind of where we act as an enabler of that to get the business the access to to whatever that technology is behind the scenes that's going to deliver the data at the time that the business needs it to make a decision.
Yeah, well, that's the bottom line, right? Is you want to be able to get to the information. And what I really liked about your approach is that you're enabling that very rapid fire drill down and discovery into the data, because as a couple of people were making a point at the top of the call today, people in the business world have less and less patience, meaning people don't want to wait for queries to come back. They don't want to wait for IT to get back to them about adding some dimension to a particular cube or something. Those days are fast disappearing, and the companies that embrace the level of speed that end users want, it seems to me those are the companies that are going to do well. And being able to navigate through these incredibly complex environments, of which are the de facto information landscapes of companies today, quickly and effectively, that's a really, really, really big deal, because I think there's a huge opportunity cost out there that is frankly it's almost like a plague on the data management industry. And the opportunity cost is that too many people have just become jaded about being able to get to what they want and what they need to make their decisions. And so they just give up and they just make decisions on gut instinct as they always did before, right? Isn't that one of the big issues, is just overcoming what you might call the ennui of the data management profession?
Right. I think that's exactly right. And it's for us, it's about, and for our customers, it's about bringing data into the day-to-day, right? To have that data at the time that you need it. This whole move from batch, where the cycle of business and the cycle of business decisions was that window to make a decision may have been months or weeks or days in the past, and now businesses are faced with new challenges and new use cases where they need to make a decision at the moment. If you look at ad tech and how automated bidding is being done, and they have a very short window to affect the ad campaign to result in profit or loss from that endeavor. And when you're faced with those kinds of use cases and challenges, you move from this kind of batch mode into the streaming analytics, the streaming real time, and really what we've started to see a lot of customers look at those infrastructures as they progress with tooling like Kafka as an enabler, is these paradigms of a continuous load. So you're always loading data, you're always bringing data in, it's always available. But where we tend to come into play, and we see that is about providing the accessibility to that data, making it available for the users, for the business users to drive their decision-making process.
Yeah, that's great stuff. It really is changing the dynamic, and I know I can tell when I look at some of these new technologies just what a sea change we're undergoing now. We're not talking about incremental improvement in these last couple of years. We're talking about revolutionary disruption in terms of what you can do and how you can do it, understanding that still a lot of the same issues are going to exist in terms of uptake, like we were talking to Eric a moment ago, in terms of getting cultural change. But for the people who do get it and the people who understand what's possible and what can be done, these are going to be the pioneers of the future, right?
Yeah, and I think what a lot of IT organizations don't realize about bringing these tools online and bringing them into the fold is that they don't necessarily have to, it's not an all or nothing thing. They don't have to bring all their data into the data lake to get, use out of it. We focus in on accessing the data wherever it lies, and that acts as an enabler as the business, as the IT organizations are standing up these new systems to handle their new use cases. They're able to continue to utilize those legacy systems that may not go away. The data may be replicated into other areas, but retiring some of these things that have been around for a long time, that have a mesh of interdependencies with other systems, that's an arduous task. But the business still needs to be able to change and move at the pace that it needs to move. So that's that complex dynamic that exists, right? And not being able to not limiting yourself by saying, well, all my data must be there and before I can start making use of it. Just looking at the problem a little bit differently and going to the tool of choice, going to where the data is, kind of one of the things that we focused on, and we've seen our customers find value in.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Des, you got some questions for Rahala?
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments on some of the stuff. I subscribe wholeheartedly to a bunch of things that have been covered by Richard and Eric and Rahala here. I mean, Rahala, you've really touched on an interesting point. There was a period of time, and I think it was a dark period in the evolution of big data, where the mantra was move everything to Hadoop because it's better and it's bigger and it's faster and it's cheaper and it's off-the-shelf hardware and it's yada yada. And people did make this shift to moving everything to this concept of a data lake, but then we kind of ended up with just this data puddle, and no one knew what to do with it. So this concept of accessing data where it is now, I think, is going to become the default. because no one can move it around. And particularly when people started doing things like standing up big data platforms in third-party public clouds, and ended up moving from hundreds of gigs to terabytes to hundreds of terabytes to then petabytes. And if you've got 1.4 petabytes of stuff sitting in a third-party public cloud, you tend not to move it around a lot because you die a death of 1,000 cuts every time you touch it, and then bringing it back home is nearly impossible. And in fact, you go back to SneakerNet and bring it back home in great big boxes of disks. So I was playing with an interesting tool the other day called Data Cleaner, and it reminded me that we've kind of now gone to this whole shift where there's two big changes. I think definitely we are now getting to the point where tools, particularly the analytic tools, not so much the actual processing engines, just reaching out to wherever the data is and getting whatever they need from it and pulling out, making some decisions, doing entity extraction or fraud detection or whatever the case may be. And that, I think that shift's definitely happened, and the tools we're seeing, like Platform and Inventor and others, are definitely doing that by default. And this Data Cleaner app just reminded me that transition's gone the right way, back to the correct way. I think the shift now, in my mind, is some of the bigger legacy platforms, the typical Oracle sort of big databases we used to pay millions of dollars of licensing for, and probably still do. What I'm seeing now is that those use cases still exist for these big platforms and sort of what people sadly refer to as legacy systems. What I think now is happening is there's less and less investment in the legacy platform and more investment in the open framework. So that something like Oracle, we might have originally put a massive Oracle cluster in place to run our financial services reporting platform. Now what we do is we end up putting a smaller cluster in place for redundancy and high availability, but these platforms just throw jobs out into the cluster. So, it's native now to do things like, say, I'm going to run a quarterly report from Oracle, and it just decides, okay, well, what platforms or frameworks have I got that I can throw these jobs onto and just let it run in the background. So, the big iron school has had to deal with the idea that they're getting less and less tin to play with in their traditional legacy platforms, but more and more tin to play with in the open platforms. Which, whether it's HDFS and just storing stuff wants to be read multiple times. But there's also an interesting shift, and I think it was Eric that sort of tabled it around this challenge that CIOs are having to cope with what that actually means. There's been a lot of things that hurt CIOs of late. I mean, shadow IT, people just buying Salesforce on a credit card and then telling them the CRM platform changed, and the CIO being the last person to get the memo, and then wondering, WTF, what happened there? That's been an interesting little change. It's sort of, it's been enabled by cloud, but sort of, shifted now into lots of very fast and rapidly deployed analytics and big data tools. And also the shift in behavior. I think Eric also mentioned the sort of shift from old waterfall platforms and, even project management methodologies like PMBOK and Prince2 being replaced with Agile, and CEOs having to deal with the fact that the chief marketing officer turns around and says, we're running this Agile project and we want to fail fast, and failure is the new black. And the CEO is thinking, well, what the hell? That's changing too quickly. And I'm sure that Richard probably had plenty of stories like that in the Fortune 500s that he's dealt with. So I think there's a couple of big challenges we're having to deal with. We're having to deal with the people issue of re-engineering staff approaches to running big projects and projects moving very quickly, and the frameworks of the projects are being run on themselves from sort of Prince2 and PMBOK to Agile. The shift from all or nothing to sort of Hadoop platforms to now, okay, we'll just use what we need. So I think one of the questions I'd love to throw back to you, Rahala, is in some of the larger projects or even medium-sized projects you've seen, how are people coping with that kind of transition, that the technology is all exciting, but then the people still have to catch up? The business has to transform.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see that, and I think that you kind of spurred some additional thought from my side on this in terms of realizing what we're seeing. We do see customers they're adopting Agile. Like, that's the de facto way to implement any kind of IT project these days, right? And they're adopting Hadoop platforms, and they're building that. But it's the big trap that we see a lot of folks get into is they're using Agile to develop their traditional ETL, process, and they're building these. They're building up their Hadoop platforms the way you would build up, a data warehouse in the 90s, and I think that process needs the refinement, right? That needs the more agile way of doing this, of understanding the business value of bringing the data to the platform before actually making a decision to do so. There's a lot of good reasons to do so, for performance, for longevity. If you have complex enrichment processes that you want to invoke through data science and other means afterwards, all of those are good things. But what we see too often is one-for-one replication from a traditional database into Hadoop, and then straight onto HDFS. And then, not realizing the data integration challenge that's there, and before even embarking on that, making the business decision on whether that's really gonna, fulfill some business mission or use case or not. Bringing data over and performing, very costly and complex data integration before even validating that business is going to get value out of the questions that they can answer from that data is kind of the opposite way you want to approach these things. You want to prototype, be able to validate the use case, validate that there's fruitful decisions that can be made from the data that you're exposing, and then you can go back and make decisions to optimize afterwards, right? And you may optimize by bringing the data over, getting the freshness up by implementing Kafka and a very robust data ingestion pipeline. But all of those without the validation that you've got the right data to fuel the business decisions that need to be made. That's where we kind of see most of our bigger customer implementations get hung up.
Yeah, I'm actually I'm going to throw back to Richard with a really quick question on the same sort of topic. I mean, you mentioned the bulk of your clients are sort of these Fortune 500. In the journey from what they may have done traditionally to kind of what you're bringing about for them now in sort of the adoption of open source and the adoption of open source analytics and big data platforms, what are the reactions been at various tiers of management all the way down to the developer on what that actually means to the company and how they're going to essentially take advantage of what Rahul was just covering there? We can move quickly and we can change quickly, but what does it actually mean to the business? What kind of responses are you seeing, and what's the sort of the take up of this whole message that open source is good and new and trustworthy?
Sure. I'll give the example of the first Spark deployment I did with a major retailer about a year and a half ago. They were using Cassandra for a back-end store for their inventory system. And, we had done a lot of effort making that the APIs around that system really fast for their online purposes. But at the end of the day, we had to come back and then do some processing on the bigger sets of data. And the only way we could actually do that at the time was using Spark, because we could access the data in Cassandra directly. So that company, it was kind of eye-opening that we had been using this NoSQL store, but now coupled with Spark, we can go do analytics on top of that data. And there's newer technologies too, like Kudu now, that enables the same thing. But that's once they see what can be done with the technologies is when it becomes eye-opening.
Eric, on the same topic, you had a great point there where CIOs have always been service providers in organizations, and I think companies in many ways have forgotten that was kind of the function of the CIO in many ways, was to essentially just provide services to the company of all things IT. Are you seeing a divergence now in the kind of the role of CIO where instead of being what might have been a slightly more hands-on approach in the organization, being a technical role and very technically competent, to more of a business function where they're trying to understand as a service provider what their client business wants and different business units and service groups demanding services? Are you seeing a transition, or what is the transition, maybe is the question I should put to you, that you're seeing in that CIO role? and the ways that they're approaching the type of things that Richard and Rahul are just talking about now, where the challenge of adopting open source and challenging some of the new open big frameworks and how fast they're moving. What sort of change are you seeing in that service provider model inside the business, and how they're transitioning that role and that function to the business, and then how the business is dealing with them? How are people going to the CIO and asking for that level of service provision?
It's a great question. I think, and this is based on sort of what I've seen both at Cloudera and more recently at Rokana. But I think that, especially when I talk to CIOs and I kind of go like, well, what are you worried about? Their response to me is less about pricing pressure over, a particular vendor, which I think are things that like I've historically heard folks talk about, and more about, well, we could return better profit to shareholders, or we could run the business more efficiently. Like the marketing team needs to understand this kind of behavior about customers and their interaction, like, again, using the e-commerce, example, like on like an online store, so the CIO's job is to figure out like, how do we do what we need to do for the business? So they're less focused on things exclusively like cost cutting and more focused on, and people have different names for it, but like, digital transformation and all of these other kinds of initiatives where, they're really looking to figure out not just how do they save the business money, but how can they help make the business money. And so they're looking to some of the newer technology as an enabler. There's a lot of, cloud initiatives, platform as a service initiatives, data lake or data hub, sort of data warehouse as a service, to the larger organization. But they're not just exclusively focused on executing, but also coming up with the strategy around how can they better take advantage of these kinds of technologies to move the business forward. And I think things like Spark and the Hadoop ecosystem are all interesting ways to do it. I think they're all, they all have a role to play there.
In a recent challenge, I've worn the CIO hat myself a number of times over my lifetime, which probably ages me very, very quickly there. I've started to introduce this concept of the office of CIO. I think it's even for a medium-sized company, the concept of a CIO is very much a dying idea in my personal view. I think, and so I've been introducing this concept of an office of CIO, like a business function. Primarily, I started out to reduce the risk on an individual to the business, and that is that if the CIO went on holiday for a month, technology went to a standstill. And so the idea was to distribute the workload from a human being point of view, from an HR and people management point of view. But what I found was interesting is that when I produced this concept of an office of CIO and put multiple people into that space and broke the challenge of delivering chief information officer function back to the business, we actually brought a whole bunch of new ideas to how things could be done, and also distributed the challenge of leveraging technology. So it was then okay for one of the Office of CIO team to sort of put this idea saying, well, we want to try implementing something slightly differently. We want to get a little proof of concept pilot going, and can we have some money for it? And then you got this broader footprint across the organization where it wasn't just one poor person running around dealing with board, dealing with the executive management team, the key stakeholders inside of service groups delivering things. It was now an army of folk running around facing the coalface and dealing with it. So I'm hoping that concept sort of gets legs, because I think the challenge for a CIO, full stop, is insurmountable now. I don't know that one person can be the champion of all things across it, because the divergence is so great. And I think that that's going to more and more of a challenge for us as the options are becoming so diverse. And it's impossible. When something's only 3 months old and it's a game changer, how does a CIO have 10 years of experience for this? And I love when I see job descriptions and CVs coming through. A job description might say things like, needs 15 years of Hadoop experience or big data experience. I'm like, really? It's only been around for 10 years. Or 7 years of Cassandra or whatever. So I think there's going to be a shift in that space. I'm hoping that does come about, and it comes about quickly. Eric, I might throw back to you for a roundup on kind of where we're at.
Yeah, sure. We got just about 6 minutes left. Maybe we'll get closing statements from everyone. I guess I'll throw it over to you, Richard, first. What's the best advice you can give companies who are trying to make the transition and maybe having some problems? I love this CIO office concept that Des just mentioned, but what are your thoughts about helping companies make the transition?
Sure. So we have, within our organization, we have a data strategy wing that we love to engage companies, all the way from C-level down to figure out how we can go prototype pieces of this puzzle, right? Because, if you try to boil the ocean with this technology, you're not going to win. We try to find, what's the big bang business things that they're trying to do now, go work in a plan to build out, the fundamental architecture and the underlying workflows that make this possible for them. It's hard work to figure out how to start tackling these problems. We have built a pretty good approach on handling that, and would love to talk to folks about that.
All right, good. And let's throw it over to Eric Sammer. What are some thoughts for you about how companies can make the transition and do so in a fairly safe but also provocative way?
Yeah, I think these days the vendor market and these sort of killer applications around this new wave of data management systems are finally catching up. You have some exciting new vendors, my bias notwithstanding. I think we're one of them for managing things like machine data and sort of data center triage and diagnostics. But you also have folks like our friends at Zoom Data, and other sort of existing BI vendors that are actually finally able to talk to this infrastructure in sort of in new and exciting ways. So, I've seen a lot of success for, sort of existing enterprises, the Fortune 500, the Global 2000, where they can adopt tooling that sort of abstracts away some of the complexity there, because talent acquisition is a big concern, especially with some of this new technology, and especially where there's still a lot of complexity. So I think it's really exciting for folks who are interested in taking advantage of, scale out parallel systems, semi-structured data, high-speed ETL and things like that, to be able to partner with vendors in those spaces. So I think that's an interesting sort of accelerator there.
Yeah, and I think you hit on the key term here, right? For the whole next generation of applications and platforms, it's scalable. You want things that are scalable. They can work at that web scale level, right?
I agree. I think that's the, bringing in this data and then turning that data into information and action within the business is no small feat. So, like Des said, you don't want to create like a data puddle, or I heard people use the term data swamp. You want to avoid those kinds of situations. So it has to be actionable.
Yeah, that's right. And Ruhala, what are your thoughts on helping companies make the transition? Because it has to happen. It seems to me for any large or mid-sized organization, it must happen. If it doesn't happen, guess what? You're going to have your lunch eaten by someone else. So what are some quick tips from you for companies to move forward?
Yeah, so some quick tips from me that, fail fast and get some quick wins. You want to get people endorsing the idea of this. It's almost more of an organizational change problem than a technology problem at times to, not bite off more than you can chew on, and then but to also make sure that what you're focusing on in terms of the data that you're delivering is the meaningful bits that the business needs right now. And so, to do that, leverage technology that lets you get in and validate and deploy fast before you get too far down the road.
Yeah, and I absolutely love this fail fast concept, or fail forward fast as some call it, because I think fear of failure has really been a generator of that opportunity cost, right? Because too many people are afraid to make a mistake, and so they instead tend to keep the status quo, or they tend to avoid taking risks. And every business venture is a risk. I mean, the bottom line is that every day you walk out the door, you're taking a risk, right, Ruhala? So I love this concept that Fail Fast is picking up. It's getting some steam because people make mistakes, right? And you have to embrace that and learn from it and then move on, right?
Exactly right.
Good stuff. Well, Des, you have 30 seconds. What are your closing comments?
Everything old is new. Everything old is new. I've had my hands, 3 years ago, IBM started putting Hadoop on mainframes, and I witnessed somebody spin up 2,000 instances of Linux running Hadoop on Java and run a job just as fast as a row of 40 racks of machines with common off-the-shelf cheap hardware. And it reminded me that everything is old is new. You know, Hadoop on mainframes, on x86 blades is a thing. And so I think we've just got to be very careful. We're moving very fast into very new, exciting territory. But sometimes the old world catches up with us, and lessons learned there shouldn't be forgotten.
Wonderful. Well, folks, you've been listening to DM Radio. Thanks again to Zoom Data and all of our guests today. We'll talk to you next time, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.